given all these attacks on voting rights, what can people do?
First and foremost, you can keep coming here to this community, to this forum, to remain educated, remain up to date. I can't overstate the importance of community and collective action.
We came to make a change. Hi, everyone. Welcome to How to Not Lose Your Shit. I'm Katie Paris, the founder of Red, Wine, and Blue. So today on the pod, we are sharing an event that we held recently with Janai Nelson, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, who argued a case the Supreme Court will decide any day now that will determine the future of voting rights in America. I wanted to share this with you because it's hard to overstate how consequential this court decision will be, and more people need to know about it. Attacks on voting rights are something that absolutely makes me lose my shit. But knowing that we have badass women like Janai fighting for us helps so much, and I know you're going to feel that way too. You know what also helps? Winning. Lately, extremist attacks, we have been successfully fighting them back. Just in recent days with this redistricting win in Virginia, where Virginians voted to protect fair elections in their state, doing a huge favor to all of us all across the country who have kind of been watching in horror at what happened in Texas and what could happen in Florida with redistricting. So much gratitude towards Virginia this week. We are especially thankful to all the Red, White, and Blue members who fought so hard against misinformation, who fought so hard against confusion to make clear exactly what was at stake. Meanwhile, the fight is still not over in Congress when it comes to stopping the SAVE Act that just seems like it will never go away. And Janai explicitly said how important Red, White, and Blue's work has been on beating back the SAVE Act again and again, and that is why we keep up this work. One thing that I love that Janai said that resonated so much with me because of the conversations we have every week here on this podcast is, how does she maintain hope? How does she sustain herself in the midst of all of this? And her answer was like, I know so many of yours are. She said, it's about community, about surrounding yourself with like-minded people who are not giving up or crawling under a blanket in despair. Although if you need to do that sometimes, that's okay too. And I'm sure Janai does have her days. So listen to Janai. I know you will enjoy learning as much from her as I did. And then go do something in community this week. LaFonda and I are getting together in person with our whole Red, Wine, and Blue team from all across the country. It's something we only get to do once a year, and it gives me so much life. So I want to ask you, what will you do this week to find your people? Let's listen to Janai.
We will rise.
Hey everyone, it is so good to see all of you streaming in, all of you sharing where you're from into the Zoom tonight, seeing all of these images of how so many of you all across the country recently have been showing up for each other and for your communities to protest ICE and to stand together for your values. Tonight, we have another opportunity to stand together, to stand up for voting rights and stay informed and learn more about what we can do. Every time you all show up, I don't know, it feels like a blessing and a surprise, and it feels powerful. And I got to tell you, I know that I especially felt like I needed it tonight. Right now, a lot of us are scared, stressed, exhausted. Millions are suffering globally right now amidst a humanitarian crisis. And chaos and threats from Washington are just meant to make us feel powerless. But at Red, Wine, and Blue, we don't buy into that. And our answer is not just outrage. Our answer is organizing. Our answer is voting. And our answer always is community. You know, a few hours ago, Julie, who many of you know, was telling me about all the RSVPs streaming in for this event. And she said that some of you were saying, you know, I wasn't sure I could make it work for tonight, but I need to be there. I need to be together. And that's one of those days. And we are always here for you, whether this is your very first time or your 100th time coming. We are glad you're here. And you couldn't have shown up for a more important topic or a more important speaker. So I am really excited about who we have with us tonight. So a little bit of context. First of all, any day now, you all, this is way too under the radar, but any day now, the U.S. Supreme Court will announce whether or not they will uphold one of the most important remaining protections against racial discrimination in voting that we have. And depending on when the decision comes, its effects could reshape the 2026 elections. This case is called Louisiana versus Callais. And the person who argued this case in front of the Supreme Court twice is Janai Nelson. And she is the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She is one of the most respected voting rights lawyers in the country, and she's here with us tonight. So I am so honored to bring on Janai Nelson. Janai?
Hi, Katie. How are you? And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in tonight. I could not agree with you more, Katie. This is a night for community. So I am delighted to be here.
All right, everyone, let's give a red, white, and blue welcome to Janai. I want you all, this woman stood before this U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, not once, but twice, standing up for voting rights, standing up against racial discrimination. You are, this internationally known expert in voting rights and election law, and you have been a tireless advocate for civil rights. How did this all get started for you? What got you interested in the law and led you to this important work?
That's a great question. I came to this in a very simple way. The kind of, if you can see it, you can be it theory. I was an undergrad at NYU, and I happened to run into a group of NYU law students, and I found that they could speak about the injustices that I was seeing, that I had, really been focused on for my entire lifetime, even in junior high and high school. But they had a lexicon for it. They had a language to talk about systemic racism and structural disenfranchisement and all of the things that I felt viscerally, that I could see and experience, but didn't quite understand A, what to call it, and B, how to solve it. And understanding that there were incredibly powerful civil rights tools out there to combat these very issues, and that our Constitution, which obviously I had learned about, but that it was animated in a different way through the civil rights movement, is really what inspired me to go to law school. I knew I would be doing something in terms of public service, but that's really when I saw law school as a possibility. I didn't grow up knowing any lawyers. I didn't have that exposure, but meeting these law students really was a pivotal moment for me.
That's a really beautiful story. I mean, I think that you just defined what people mean when they say a sense of calling, you
Yeah,
know?
absolutely.
And where it's like you have that sense that like your gifts might meet where the world is, hungry for answers, and like where those two things meet up. That's that amazing place. I think they call it calling. That's really cool. All right. So, Janai, I want to get into it. You recently argued the case Louisiana versus Callais before the US Supreme Court. And this is an extremely consequential case on voting rights for our country. But for those who may not be lawyers and for those who may not be familiar with what exactly this case is all about, can you break it down for us in plain language?
Absolutely. At its core, this case is all about power. It is all about political power. It's about constitutional power. So it's about the power of voters to have their vote counted equally as every other resident of their state in elections ranging from congressional to state legislative to even city council elections. It's also about Congress's power. Congress has explicit power in the Constitution under the 14th and 15th Amendments to create legislation to animate the principles in both of those amendments. And that is really being challenged when we see a challenge to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And, this case came about because Black voters in Louisiana have experienced racial discrimination in the area of voting and in many other areas of life, but in the area of voting for many, many decades. And even though they comprise the largest percentage of the state's population of any state outside of Mississippi, if you look at the 6 congressional districts in the state, they can elect only in one district, a candidate who is their choice and who is responsible and accountable to them. And we thought that that imbalance was deeply unfair, that it was a result of not only historical discrimination, but present day discrimination as well. And we were able to amass evidence and prove that that was in fact the case. And we got a federal court to agree and say, yes, this is an example of race discrimination. And as a remedy, we were able to get a second district. We got the maps redrawn for the congressional map, and there was a second district produced that not only remedied the racial discrimination, but also protected the seats of the incumbents. So this was a negotiation with the state, and the state has a very powerful Republican delegation that includes Mike Johnson, includes Stephen Scalise. And so there was a real interest in the state to preserve the power of their incumbents. And we came up with a map that did both solve the racial discrimination, also preserved the districts of the incumbents. And we thought our job was done. We actually had an election and it went without a hitch. And Black voters in Louisiana were able to elect 2 representatives to serve their needs and their interests. But lo and behold, there was another suit filed by white voters in that second district, and they asserted a claim that they were being discriminated against because they were now in a district where Black voters finally had an opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. So that's the battle that we're fighting. Those are the facts underlying the battle that we're fighting in the Supreme Court. And it's an interesting one because in the state of Louisiana, white voters are still overrepresented in the number of districts that they control. But we are still seeing this claim of reverse discrimination gaining traction, not just in cases like Louisiana versus Callais, but in so many sectors of society. And it's deeply alarming. It shows that there's still a significant power struggle in this country that centers on race.
So as I understand it, Louisiana, approximately a third of the population is Black voters. Is that right? Okay.
That's it.
You just said that the map that Louisiana wants here is there would be one district, 1 out of 6 districts that would allow for that representation. I'm not like the best at math, so I use my little calculator on my phone, but 1/6 is about 16.5%. So, like, what is controversial about your facts here when it comes to saying, okay, the Black population is a third of the state, so how about they get a third of the districts? Like, what's the controversy, Janai? Other than the fact, look, I know what this Supreme Court is. I know how political it is. I know it brings a certain point of view. I mean, is that it?
It's a little bit more complicated in that even though for most of us, it's intuitive, right? If you're 1/3 of the population, in theory, you would control 1/3 of the congressional seats or 1/3 of the state legislative seats or whatever it is.
Right.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is one of the most transformative pieces of legislation out of the civil rights movement, has a clause that says there's no right to proportional representation. So right out the gate, you can't just win on numbers alone. The numbers are relevant because they do give you a hint that something may be wrong, but we can't go in there and just say, here's the population, here are the districts that population controls, that's it, we deserve more. You can't do that. You actually have to prove that you have a populous group of people who vote together often, whose votes are often overwhelmed by a contrary vote that is not in their interest and that it poses some of the issues that they most care about. There's a very complicated set of factors that you must meet. It requires expert testimony, demographers, statisticians. I mean, this is a very
Yes.
complicated
Yes.
claim to make, and we made it. And a
Yep.
federal judge agreed with us. Not
Yes.
once, not twice, but 3 times, right? So so we cleared the hurdle of
Yeah.
showing that it wasn't just the numbers, it was more than the numbers. There were
Yeah.
actually acts of discrimination that led to that result, and that's why we won. That's how we got that 2nd district. But unfortunately, claims of reverse discrimination, where aggrieved voters challenge the use of race in any and all contexts, even
Yeah.
when it's meant to remedy race discrimination, is
Right.
really what this fight is about.
I mean, to me, that seems to be the core of it. When we had, so this all comes down to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, monumental piece of legislation that we seem on the one hand to herald in this country in a very patriotic sense of like, this was such a groundbreaking, and for a long time, it seemed like there was a bipartisan consensus on that
Yeah.
across races. This is a good thing. This is what makes us America. But yet we have had in the last, I guess it's 15, 20 years or so, the chipping away of it. It was Section 5 that made a lot of the federal protections weaker. Um, Maybe that was 20-ish years ago. You would know exactly, I'm sure.
2013, yeah.
Oh, more recently. So all of this is more recent, even. Okay. And then now we have this with Section 2. Can you explain the significance? Like, how do you see this in terms of the Voting Rights Act and the overall project here to what feels like a very focused dismantling piece by piece?
Yeah, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is something that I think so many people take for granted. They don't recognize that before that act was passed, we were not a democracy, that we denied the right to vote to broad swaths of our population, that the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, which gives everyone the right to vote free of race discrimination, wasn't being enforced until Congress used its enforcement powers and enacted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which you point out was a bipartisan piece of legislation. And even in the subsequent years, when certain provisions needed to be reauthorized by Congress, we had overwhelming bipartisan support of those provisions. So, the question is what happened in the interim? And I think we all know there has been an unleashing of a strain of racism and discrimination that is undermining the civil rights project. And I think part of that is because people don't fully appreciate how much work the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation has done. So if we think about the
Mhm.
Voting Rights Act of 1965, I like to call it the birth certificate of our democracy because
I
we
love that.
really weren't one before then. That is when you can see us beginning to take the steps towards maturing as a multiracial democracy. So, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended blatantly discriminatory practices like poll taxes, where you actually
Right.
had to pay a fee in order to vote, literacy tests, where people who were denied access to public education or an equal education, who were denied the ability to access, tools for literacy, were given literacy tests, and they were also just discriminatorily administered, right? So some people had to interpret texts of the Constitution, and others could use one word or might not be tested at all. And then there were also grandfather clauses. So you could vote if your grandfather was
Right.
eligible to vote. And if you think about the time, 1965, many Black people had grandparents, grandfathers who were denied the right to vote because they were formerly enslaved.
Right.
So all of these tactics were meant to keep Black people primarily outside of the electorate. And the Voting Rights Act changed all of that. It made all of those practices unlawful. And then it also had a very visionary requirement, which meant that in certain parts of this country that had a demonstrated history of race discrimination, if any new laws were proposed around elections, they had to be pre cleared. They had to be vetted by either the Department of Justice or a federal court to make sure that they weren't some other attempt at discriminating against voters. So this was a prophylactic measure to ensure that our new voting laws did not carry forward the same discrimination that had infected our electoral processes up to that point. So the Voting Rights Act really.
So that was Section 5. That was 2013, what you just described, right? Getting rid of that pre-clearance, that check to make sure that we're still in alignment
right.
with the Voting Rights Act as intended. Now, so that was a major blow to the Voting Rights Act in 2013. So here we are 13 years later from that, and we are now looking at Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act taking a major blow. Can you explain then, fast forward to that chapter, what is so significant about Section 2? We're going to go to the weeds, y'all. We can do it. Janai's here to help us. Why Section 2 is so significant and why dismantling it potentially with this decision would be so significant.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to clear through the weeds as quickly as possible.
You're good at
So,
that.
as you pointed out, in 2013, there was a Supreme Court case, Shelby County versus Holder, which struck down and effectively disabled Section 5. So now laws could be passed without any vetting about whether they would be discriminatory, whether they would wind up harming certain voters more than others. And we saw a proliferation of voter suppression bills. So we now talk about voter suppression and we've been talking about the number of laws that have been passed, but it is truly extraordinary. It means that since the Shelby decision, 31 states have passed 115 laws that make it harder for people to vote. And in that, there are 44 laws from states that were previously subject to this pre-clearance process. So we see those offenders are pushing forward so many laws that we find to be discriminatory and that limit the ability to cast a ballot that will be counted. So that's the landscape that we're in post, Section 5. And now, when we tried to use another provision of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, which doesn't have a preclearance, but it allows you after the fact to challenge a law. So if a law looks discriminatory, and if it's discriminatory in practice, we can use Section 2. But then there was a case just a few years ago called Brnovich, where Justice Alito said, actually, Section 2 can't be used to challenge voter suppression laws. So that was another blow to the Voting Rights Act. And the final piece of that civil rights legislation, which the Supreme Court once called the crown jewel of civil rights legislation, is the part of Section 2 that protects against racial gerrymandering and discrimination in redistricting. And that is what's at stake before this Supreme Court in Louisiana versus Callais, which I had the privilege of arguing in October.
Wow. It really has been a very focused project in dismantling, and we truly can see each of those effects. This is why the courts matter so much and why we have to pay attention to what's coming out of the Supreme Court. Can we, in terms of expected potential impact, if this decision goes the wrong way, can you talk about what those potential impacts could look like and also some of the timing? Because as I understand it, if the Supreme Court comes out with this decision end of this week, that could potentially be very different what the impacts are versus if they don't come out with it until later, in the summer at the end of the term.
Yeah, timing is everything. Timing is everything in this case. And I'll get to that in a moment. But because in terms of the impact, I think it's really important that people fully appreciate what happens after any part of the Voting Rights Act is weakened. So we saw in 2013 that unleashed a whole slew of voter suppression laws that we're dealing with now. The racial turnout gap also expanded. It's now growing twice as fast in places that were previously subject to preclearance, like Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Georgia and North Carolina and Florida and Texas and all of those places. And if we were to lose the remaining portions of Section 2 that are still enforced to protect against racial redistricting, we are going to see I can't even describe the catastrophic impact that this will have on our districting lines, on the ability of voters to cast a ballot on fair maps. That will be pretty much off the table. It's already threatened because of partisan gerrymandering, because the Supreme Court has thrown up its hands and said it can't determine whether something is partisan or not. We know that if racial gerrymandering is permitted, it's going to be a free for all. And we'll see Black voters, Latino voters, Asian voters used in ways to manipulate outcomes, to serve political parties, and to ultimately dilute their votes. And I have to say, one of the most alarming predictions about this comes from a report by Fair Fight Action and Black Voters Matter, where they did an analysis and said if the Supreme Court takes an axe to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, anywhere between 25 and 30% of Black Congress people will have their districts redrawn and potentially eliminated. As many as, as much as 11% of the congressional Hispanic caucus could lose their seats. So we're talking about a complete change in the complexion, the literal complexion of leadership in this country, and the ability of voters of color to elect representatives who are accountable to them and have their interests at heart. And that could be a devastating, devastating outcome. And it's not just for voters of color. The Voting Rights Act has made our governing bodies fairer and more equitable and more representative for all people throughout this country. So this could really shape the future of redistricting nationwide and would change the face of power in a great many ways.
I think about how long we all have been fighting to have more representative leaders when it comes to race, when it comes to gender, when it comes to rural, suburban, urban. There's so many different ways in which it's important for our leaders to accurately represent the people. And we are so far from that even today. And so when I think of how much this would rewind the clock even further, as you said, I can't even describe what a devastating blow that would be to progress. Okay, I am beginning to see some really good questions come in the chat. And what I want to say to everyone is that right now, I am going to bring up two people from our community to ask questions to Janai. I'm really excited to include in the conversation. So that being said, I want to bring on Mary from Wichita Falls, Texas. She is a leader of one of the Red, Wine, and Blue network groups down there, the very active Wichita Women for Justice and Democracy. Some might call them WWJD. And Mary, we're excited to have you come on because living in Texas, we know you're very concerned about voting rights, everything that's been going on with redistricting down there. Mary, can you share your question for Janai?
Absolutely. And thank you. Thank you for being here. And thank you for inviting us to ask our question. So obviously, living in Texas, we are very familiar with the negative effects of redistricting. Very familiar. And if the court strikes down Louisiana's map, what happens immediately in Louisiana and what could happen next in other states like Texas?
Mary, great to see you and meet you. This brings me back to the question about timing. So this is really important. So the state of Louisiana asked for a decision in early January, and we all expected that the court was going to issue a decision by their requested deadline. The court has not done that. There are myriad views and predictions as to why that is happening. But I will say that the longer the decision, takes to come out, the less likely it is to see a wholesale redrawing of lines. But it's not out of the question. It is still possible. State legislatures can initiate a special session and try to redraw the lines. And we've already seen the mid-cycle, off-cycle redistricting that the White House has commanded of many states. We see what your state of Texas is doing. We see some of the counterattacks in states like California. But if we look across the country, this is the most widespread off-cycle redistricting that we've ever witnessed. And it would invite more if the Supreme Court were to say that these types of opportunity districts that remedy race discrimination are no longer lawful. We can see many of those districts being challenged and potentially redrawn even before this upcoming midterm election. So there's a lot hanging in the balance on this Supreme Court decision. One of the things that LDF is ready to do the moment the decision comes down, if these efforts move forward, is to challenge them, right? Because in all likelihood, they will dilute the votes of Black voters. They will manipulate different districts in ways that will likely discriminate. And we will do everything we can to prevent those maps from coming into play before the midterm elections. But it won't just be us. We'll be litigating with colleagues and other organizations throughout the country, but we are prepared to protect those districts and protect those voters as much as possible using the Constitution and every other tool we have.
Thank you.
Mary, that means all that voter registration work y'all are doing down there could not be more important, and making sure that those new voters who are getting registered actually get out to vote. That is the power that all of us have to overcome these horrible decisions that are coming from above. We still have that power, and thank you for exercising it through your grassroots work. It's so important.
Thank you, Mary.
Okay, now I am excited to bring on Sydney Womack, who is a first-year law student at Loyola University in Chicago. And she is deep into learning about Supreme Court precedent and con law, and Louisiana versus Callais will likely be a case that, Sydney, that you'll be studying in the near future. If you all haven't already been talking about it, probably into the future, law students will be studying it. Before I get to your question, I have one quick question for you, Sydney. What did you think of hearing what Janai said about what inspired her to get into studying the law? And did that resonate with you, like as a law student?
Yeah, for sure. It was really cool to hear your story about that. And it's been really incredible just to hear everything that you've been saying, especially having this con law background now this semester, and reading a lot of these cases, especially like the affirmative action cases. It reminds me a lot of what you're fighting for now. And so, yeah, it's really cool to hear your story and see how you've used the law to really make amazing changes for our world.
You could be the next Janai, Sydney. We're going to be cheering for you. Okay. So, Sydney, tell us your question that you've got.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could just share what it was like to stand before the Supreme Court and argue such a high stakes case, and then what stood out to you during oral arguments.
Love that.
Great question. And Sydney, I'm very excited that not only are you a law student, but that you're taking time to be engaged in this way. So kudos to you. I'm very excited about whatever you choose to do, and you should hit me up offline if you're thinking about civil rights law. So as one can imagine, it was, sort of, it's the pinnacle of one's career as a lawyer to argue before the Supreme Court. It's like, being an athlete and going to the Olympics, and it carries that weight. This particular argument was very significant because, I was involved in the case, as I am with all of our Supreme Court cases, but I was on the sidelines. I was, helping with strategic vision. I wasn't sort of a day-to-day lawyer on the case. And this case was actually argued in March of last year by another colleague of mine, someone who had been, with the case from the trial court, who had been litigating it. He did a superb job arguing it in March, and we were expecting a decision in June. And instead, the court said, no, we want to hear argument again in the fall. And we were all a little mystified about why the court couldn't come to a decision. And then we got the question that they wanted us to address in August. And that question squarely brought in the Constitution to this case and said, are these remedies constitutional under the 14th and 15th Amendments? And that's when we knew this was not just your average query, that this was a potential attempt to undermine Section 2 as a whole, and perhaps even the Voting Rights Act as a whole. And as a result, I got involved in the case in a unique way. I actually hadn't argued before an appellate court in a decade. So this was actually quite new for me. It was my first time arguing before the Supreme Court. I was literally pulled out of retirement, and very glad that I participated in this historic case because the stakes were so high, and the consequences are so potentially dire that we wanted to put every single resource we had as an institution into this fight, and that included me.
That was a really good question, Sydney. I
Yeah.
loved getting to hear about that. I can't even
Yes.
imagine what that would be like.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It was pretty exhilarating. I think you also asked, what was surprising or what did I learn in the argument? I've been in the Supreme Court many times hearing arguments. I go every term and listen to some of the most consequential cases. And it's a relatively small courtroom, but there's nothing that prepares you for being, literally within 5 feet or so of the justices. It's a very intimate space. And so having that direct colloquy with different justices and seeing their demeanor up close and confronting them about issues where I know many of them already had preconceived notions of what the outcome should be, was something I was prepared for, but it was, I would say, a very unique and different experience being before the highest court of the land.
Wow. Sydney, thank you for being here and good luck. Stay in
Thank
touch. I
you.
can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank
Not
you.
only in law school, but with the degree.
Yeah.
Okay, Janai, so you spoke, obviously this was far from your first case. You have a whole career of fighting through the law for our civil rights. I know, for example, you successfully challenged strict voter ID laws in Texas, and you've also pushed back attempts to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is my question. What is the common thread that is connecting these fights together?
Yeah, I love this question. We've been seeing for decades, and it's coming to a head now in a way that I think people are just finally appreciating. But we've been seeing a a sort of misguided explanation of fairness of what constitutes discrimination, of what equal protection means. We've been seeing the civil rights wins being twisted for decades. And we've signaled that. We've said when you attack affirmative action and say that you only need it for, 25 years, which is, what Justice O'Connor said, in the early aughts. And when we are civil rights lawyers who are in the Deep South and we're seeing the inequity not only in the type of education that public school students are getting, but the resources that they get from textbooks to the types of facilities that they're in, we know that it's going to take more than a prescripted time period to undo not only historical discrimination, but ongoing discrimination. When we talk to voters who have their polling sites moved, who are intimidated through robocalls telling them that they may have to pay child support or they may have to pay their taxes if they show up at a voting polling site. When we hear about the number of machines distributed to some voters, primarily Black voters, and the machines distributed to other voters that cause an unequal distribution of access to vote and causes people to wait on long lines and sometimes miss out on the ability to cast a vote. We know that the real world consequences of these sometimes race neutral laws are racially discriminatory.
Yes.
And we've been saying this over and over again. And we're seeing these threads in our economic justice work, our education equity work, our political participation work, and our all of our work everywhere. So
Yeah.
I think that thread is a common misconception that we can somehow get away from race discrimination by ignoring race, and nothing could be further than the truth. It's something that we're going to have to confront. It's something that we need to address through legislation. We need to be proactive about it, which is, again, what I think the Voting Rights Act was so visionary about. Instead of challenging laws after the fact, we should make sure that the laws we have and the laws that we adopt don't exacerbate the inequities in our society. And we're seeing what decades of running from that problem have done to our democracy. We're seeing that, in stark relief in the Trump administration. And my firm hope is that on the other side of this, we can build back better and we can understand what was too too undeveloped and what really needs to be battened down and what holes need to be plugged to make sure that we can have a functioning multiracial democracy.
We have to do so much better. Okay. While we have you, Janai, I've got to ask you about a couple other hot topics in the voting rights space right now, because unfortunately there are a lot of attacks on voting rights day in and day out. We wanted to devote this event to the Supreme Court case, but also wanted to get your expertise on a couple of things. So Red, Wine, and Blue members have been fighting off the SAVE Act for many, 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 many months now in many different iterations. Can you give us your view, the update on where we are?
Absolutely. Well, first, let me say thank you, thank you, thank you. Your work was not in vain. As you know, the SAVE Act has not passed, and that is due to people like you being very vocal and explaining what this means. I like to call the SAVE Act the Stop All Voters Everywhere Act. It is saving no one. It is actually destructive to our electoral process. And
Right.
we know that it's an effort for Trump to consolidate power, to entrench power by denying large parts of our electorate the ability to cast a ballot that will be counted. The documentary proof of citizenship requirement would be devastating to many voters across all backgrounds. We know that it impacts, 70 million women. We know that, or people who've changed their name generally. We know that, most Black voters under 30 don't have a passport or a birth certificate at the ready to prove their citizenship. We know that disabled voters and voters who live in rural America will have a hard time registering to vote by proving this, and even going to vote by proving their documentary citizenship. So kudos to everyone who pushed back. It made a real difference. That doesn't mean, however, that this same bill, maybe renamed, maybe not, is not going to rear its head again. And so it's something that we have to really pay attention to. The latest missive has been this mail-in voting executive order that Trump just—
That's where I was going next. Let's hit the executive order. Yes.
Trump
Where
just
are we on that?
Yeah, and last week, well, that's part of it. There was a part of the SAVE Act that dealt with, showing proof of citizenship in casting any ballot, including mail-in ballots. And so, after folks helped to defeat the passage of the SAVE Act, the next iteration of this voter suppression is in that mail-in voting executive order, which is blatantly illegal and unconstitutional. It directs the United States Postal Service to prevent the delivery of lawful ballots. And it also tries to force the United States Postal Service to oversee elections. And listen, while I salute our postal workers, they are not in the business of running elections and should not be in the business of running elections. And the Constitution is really unambiguous here. The power to regulate elections lies with the states and with Congress, not with the president. So this order is really a stunning and brazen assault on that authority. And I'm very proud to say that LDF joined a lawsuit with the ACLU and the Brennan Center and Asian Americans Advancing Justice and Latino Justice the day after that EO dropped, that executive order dropped, challenging that effort to suppress the vote. And it's something that we are litigating along with a number of other groups who've also filed lawsuits to ensure that mail-in voting remains a protected, safe, secure, and effective method that nearly 1 in 3 Americans rely on to cast their ballots, including Trump and his family, who recently voted by mail in a Florida election. So if it's good enough for him and his family, it's certainly good enough for us. We have to keep our eye on the SAVE Act, and we have to keep our eye on this executive order against mail-in voting, and to support the litigation that is beating that executive order back.
From your perspective, given all these attacks on voting rights, what can people do? What can I do? What can everyone here do to protect voting rights now, regardless of how the court rules, whether it's next week or in the coming months?
So I love this question because I think we all need to start gearing up. And, first and foremost, you can keep coming here to this community, to this forum, to remain educated, remain up to date, to get your marching orders. I can't overstate the importance of community and collective action in this moment. So kudos to everyone who's part of Red, Wine, and Blue. Stay committed. It's only going to become more crucial as we head toward the midterms. And even after that, we have to stay focused because there are state and local elections year round. But let me break it down, I guess, into a few categories. One is, individual action that you can take, contacting your members of Congress, letting them know what you think about, legislation like the Save America Act that we just talked about, making sure that the Senate's phone number is on speed dial on your phone. It's 202-224-3121. We should all have that saved in our favorites. If you need to schedule a reminder for yourself to call the Senate once a week or every other week and find out what legislation or what nominee to push back against, there's a lot coming up. The Department of Justice is going to be replacing Bondi. There are still judicial nominees that are coming forward. It's important to stay abreast of what's happening and call your Senate, call your senator and your senators and tell them what you want. I know everyone on this call is prepared to vote, is registered to vote, but let's not take that for granted. There are a lot of rules that are in flux. There are a lot of attempts to bump people off the voting rolls. So even those of us who are regular voters, who feel very confident that our registration won't be challenged, we need to make sure that that's in fact the case as we head toward, either primary elections or the general elections coming up in November. And especially if we want to take advantage of early voting, et cetera, we need to make sure that we don't miss any deadlines. And then we need to fan out and make sure that everyone in our networks and our communities have that same information and that they have a plan to vote. Especially if you know someone who isn't planning to vote, please talk about the importance of this election.
Okay, so everyone, I know you all think you're registered to vote. There are purges happening all the time. I know here in my county in Ohio, we recently learned there were tens of thousands of people removed from the voter rolls for reasons that make no sense. And all kinds of folks have been realizing that they are not on the rolls. So even if you're sure you are, unless you checked it today, check your voter registration and tell all your friends. Hit that group chat and tell all your friends to do that too. And that family chat. I'm going to do that tonight too. I'm going to make sure my family members have done that. Number 2, we have sent out lots of actions on the SAVE Act. If anyone here has not taken action on the SAVE Act, or you know what, if you haven't today, go ahead and take action there. You can send emails. We'll send you a follow-up email after you send the emails to your reps so you can make calls. And then also, look, Janai and I have really been emphasizing the importance of community. That is not just like a nice thing to say. It is literally how we fight everything. We have to do it together. Red, Wine, and Blue launched an app in the last several months. It's called the Red, Wine, and Blue app. If you go into any of your app stores on your phone and look up Red, Wine, and Blue, you can find it. That's how you can be connected 24/7 to this community. We are going to make sure that you have the most up-to-date information. Anything Janai wants us to make sure you'll have, we'll put it in the app. That's also how you can check your voter registration in there too. And as the election comes near, we're going to make sure you have all the information that you need to get to everyone you know about voting. Whether it's getting registered to vote, whether it is ensuring that people have the plan to vote, whether it is any other information they need in the lead up to November. So please join us there. If you're not already on the app, we need you. We need you on the app. Okay, with that, Julie Collins, can you come up? Because I know that you have been tracking some questions from the chat.
Yes, indeed I have. And actually, one of the most recent one was, how do you check to see if you're registered to vote? I think somebody's putting that in the chat, or at least I hope they are. Janai, do you have something really quick that somebody could check?
Yeah, I mean, there are state databases, which I think are really important because you want to know what your state is saying about you. So some of this is just state dependent. Some states have already given their voter rolls over to this administration. So it used to be that you could go to some of these aggregator sites, but I think it's most important that you check what your state believes is your voter registration status.
Right. I agree. I absolutely agree. Okay, so I'm gonna try to condense some of these down. There were like almost 30 questions in the chat.
Oh.
So folks were asking, what do we need to do to institute voting rights for all, especially for women? And would the John Lewis Voting Rights Act be enough, or do we need to do more?
That's an excellent question. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is absolutely the first step in building a foundation towards a multiracial democracy that will serve us for the next 250 years, but it is by no means the only step. There's also the Freedom to Vote Act, which counteracts a lot of the voter suppression mechanisms. There's also the Native American Voting Rights Act, which addresses specific harms to our indigenous communities here in the US. And what I suspect is part of this question is that there is no positive right to vote in our Constitution. Our right to vote, to the extent that it's referenced in the Constitution, is all about, the fact that you can vote free from discrimination. You can vote if you are a woman. You can vote if you are 18 years or older. It's about really particularized groups, but it's not a right to vote writ large. And when we refound this democracy, which is what we must do on the other side of this nightmare, we need to have a positive right to vote, something that is anchored in the Constitution and that is sacrosanct. In the meantime, what the Legal Defense Fund is doing is we are trying to get voting rights acts enacted across the country. And we're very excited about that project. Maryland will be voting on a voting rights act next week. New Jersey just passed a voting rights act. There are about, almost close to a dozen states that have voting rights acts. And some people are surprised to hear that even in the state of Louisiana and Alabama, we've helped to introduce those acts. We know that they're not likely to get passed immediately, but you have to start somewhere. You have to start socializing these ideas. So that is our mission. While the federal government is in disarray and dysfunction, we're moving on the state and local levels.
Okay, that's great. We always say when they go low, we go local. So that's absolutely fantastic. Um, so um, someone asked, how do you hold on to hope during all of this?
That's a great question. In a few ways, I have an amazing staff of fighters who, get up every day to do this work and are often telling me that they can't imagine being anywhere else or doing anything else in this moment. And I feel very much the same way. So one, surrounding yourself, back to this community idea, surrounding yourself by like-minded people, by people who are not giving up, or not, crawling under a blanket in despair, definitely gives me hope. But also interacting a lot with young people. I mean, look at Sydney. That was wonderful to see a young person who is facing the demands of law school, but is also carving out time for activism. And there are so many young people who are doing that, young people who are running for office. I'm reading, on a regular basis, someone who's like the youngest person ever to run for mayor or run for city council person. The young people are showing us how it's done. They have a sense of, I think, entitlement in the best of ways, that they are
Mhm.
entitled to dignity, they're entitled to respect, they're entitled to be free from discrimination. And I love that. I mean, that's what we did, right? We raised this generation to have that degree of confidence, and we're now seeing that enter the political arena, and I could not be more proud.
Yes, that's just absolutely it. That's what does my heart good as well.
Mhm.
It really, really does. Okay, so a lot of people had questions about the fact that you argued this in October and yet nothing has been decided. So, how long do they have to decide? And if they and if they do decide something, is there time where they could either, if it went the wrong way, ruin 2026, voting, or would it be, off into another year?
It really depends on what the decision says, and there are so many permutations of what they might do. They typically issue all of their rulings by the end of June. That's when the Supreme Court goes on recess for the summer. So most of the blockbuster decisions, and this would be considered one of them, comes out in June. There have been times when decisions have been issued in July. So in this climate, we know that all conventions don't necessarily hold. So we can't predict. But typically, if things are normal, we would get a decision by the end of June. But we can get one any day now. Any time that there is a date on the calendar where the Supreme Court can issue a decision, we are refreshing our browsers at 10 a.m. to see whether they have, decided this particular case. The longer the court takes to issue a decision, the shorter the window states would have to upend the current district lines. So certainly time is on our side. But we have to be prepared for anything. We have to be prepared for the most rogue and rank actors to do the mischief that they've been wanting to do all along. And so we're preparing for a battle.
Why did they actually decide to hear the case a second time? Do you know?
Well, one can only believe it's because they want to, interrogate the constitutionality of Section 2 and of race-based remedies, because they had everything they needed to decide the facts of this case, the real facts of it. They had all of that based on the argument in March and the briefs that we already submitted. This question about whether these race-based remedies or remedies that even take race into account conflict with the 14th and 15th Amendment, that tells us that they are perhaps trying to apply some of the illogic of the affirmative action cases in the voting rights context. We saw that in the briefs from some of our opponents, that there are some folks on the court who wanted a second bite at this apple. And so, we delivered it and we defended our position, even with the broader constitutional question on the table.
All heady stuff.
Janai, we are so thankful for your time tonight. And even more than that, just so grateful for the work you've done and how you have fulfilled that goal that you had when you saw those law students, talking about the world in a way that you wanted to be able to, and to be able to talk about it and to change it. And you are now giving that gift to us of helping us understand what is going on, because these issues are complex and complicated, but it is worth the effort to become informed and stay informed and take action. And being able to hear and learn from you tonight and get some of those marching orders, I assure you, we are here to have your back and keep up this fight. I hope we can be in touch with you, because I know we do not know how this decision is going to go. But regardless, we will be ready. Please consider us part of, your crew to have your back and to take next steps together. Everyone, please do make sure you've checked those voter registrations, and please do make sure that you're on that Red, Wine, and Blue app. And when you're in there, make sure to join the national community so you can come in and ask questions and share your stories there. But Janai, do you have any parting words for tonight? More than anything, we just want to say thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you. Thank you for creating this community, for maintaining this community, for being part of it, for supporting organizations like LDF that are doing the work. And you can join the fight by joining our election protection work, by becoming a poll monitor. There are so many ways to get involved. So, please come to our website and use us as a trusted resource. And I'm happy to return once we get the decision to talk about what it means.
I would love that. Okay, it's a date. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for being with us here tonight. Let's keep finding community and let's keep fighting together. Those things go hand in hand, always.
How to Not Lose Your Shit is a podcast from Red, Wine, and Blue. It's hosted by Katie Paris and LaFonda Cousin and produced by Amy Thorstensen. To learn more about Red, Wine, and Blue, you can find us on social media, on the Red, Wine, and Blue app, or on our website at redwine.blue.
Look around, there's something going down, but we're looking up. We move with confidence. We're making a difference wherever we are. Good trouble is not too far. We've got the fire, we've got the grit. Through the thick of it, so powerful we are. So powerful we are. So if you see us coming, just know we're making a change, and we're not running. No, we're not going away. We stand together, and we can stop the rain. Just know that if we came to make a change. Make a change, make a change, make a change. Oh yes, we came to make a change. Make a change, make a change, make a change, make a change. Oh yes, we came to make a change. Together, side by side, troublemakers, heads held high. Oh, the journey may be long, but we still keep singing our song. So if you see us coming, just know we're making a change, and we're not running. No, we're not going away. We stand together, and we can stop the rain. Just know that if we came to make a change. If you see us coming, just know we're making a change, and we're not running. No, we're not going away. We stand together, and we can stop the rain. Just know that if we came to make a change. Make a change, make a change, make a change. Oh yes, we came to make a change. Make a change, make a change, make a change, make a change. Oh yes, we came to make a change. R-W-B. We came to make a change. R-W-B. We came to make a change.